On my drive back to Fort Belvoir, I spotted a family stranded in a raging flash flood. Breaking rule number 4, I fastened the tow chains and dragged them to safety. The father only remembered my name later, then my commander summoned me for a report that could end my career. But inside that office sat a man wearing 4 stars on his uniform. Can you imagine a choice that costs you everything you've worked for, your entire career, your reputation, your future, all because you stopped to save a life? I faced that exact choice, alone in a raging storm, a tiny baby's blue lips staring back at me. They called me reckless, emotional, a liability, but what they didn't know is the life I truly saved that night. And what that moment would ignite. It was 2 a.m., the kind of dark that feels heavy, even in the middle of Virginia. Rain was lashing down, a relentless drumming against the windshield of my LMTV, that's a light-medium tactical vehicle, basically a 5'10" army truck. The wipers squeaked a lonely rhythm, barely keeping up. I was on the transport route back to Fort Belvoir, following procedure. Everything was silent, safe, normal. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights swept across the shoulder, and my heart slammed into my ribs. There it was, a civilian SUV, flipped on its side, half submerged in black, churning water. A man, soaking wet and frantic, was waving his hands in the storm, just waving. And inside, a woman, pale with terror, clutching a child whose tiny lips were already turning blue. My stomach tightened into a knot harder than any tactical gear. The chill running down my spine wasn't from the broken AC, it was from my operations notebook, sitting right there on the passenger seat. Rule number 4, strictly forbade stopping. My chest constricted. My breathing hitched. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles screamed white. I looked in the rearview mirror, and those father's pleading eyes drilled straight into my soul. If I hit the gas, if I kept going, they would freeze to death, or worse. If I stopped? A 12-year career, everything I'd built, wiped out by a brutal disciplinary report. The radio crackled uselessly, no one to talk to, no one to ask. Just me, the rain, and that impossible choice. I gritted my teeth, a desperate prayer forming in my mind, and slammed the brakes. The 5'10" truck shrieked, fishtailing precariously on the soaked asphalt. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be an emotionless obedience machine. I was Lieutenant Millie Evans, and tonight, I accepted trading my rank, my future, everything, to fight for the lives of these 3 strangers. Was the price of compassion too high? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. I slapped the hazard lights. The amber glow pulsed weakly, struggling against the pitch-black Virginia night, barely cutting through the curtain of rain. I kicked the door open, and the wind nearly tore the heavy steel plating right off its hinges, slamming it back towards my face. The rain felt like gravel pellets hitting my exposed skin. I jumped down. Immediately, the freezing mud of the roadside ditch swallowed my tactical boots, rising past my ankles with a sickening squelch. The water was already up to the man's waist. He was bashing his bloody elbow against the rear window, panic making his movements jagged, wild. My baby! My baby is stuck. His scream was swallowed by a crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath my feet. I didn't think about regulation number 4 anymore. Standing there in that deluge, waist-deep in freezing sludge, the SOP manual dissolved. There was only one order left, the one I learned in Sunday school back in the foothills, not in basic training: do not walk on by. I had to drag them out of this death trap before the flash flood took us all. Stand back! I roared over the gale, ripping the crowbar from the side utility mount of the truck. I swung hard. Crack! The rear safety glass shattered, the sound mixing with the terrifying, high-pitched wail of an infant. The woman inside was pale, shock setting in. She was curled around the baby like a human shield, trying to push her last bit of body heat into the child. I waded through the rushing current, the water tugging at my legs like invisible hands. My fingers were numb, clumsy blocks of ice, as I hooked the heavy steel tow chains onto the SUV's undercarriage frame. Asterisk click. Lock asterisk. This wasn't a drill at the motor pool. This was life or death. I signaled the man to hold on tight, then scrambled back up into the LMTV's high cab. I threw it into low gear. "Come on, big girl," I whispered to the engine, willing it to respond. I eased off the clutch. The massive tires spun in the mud for a heart-stopping second, spewing sludge before they finally bit into the asphalt. The truck groaned, the chain pulled taut, and slowly, agonizingly, the SUV slid out of the grave and onto the shoulder. We didn't speak much on the ride. I couldn't take them to the base. The MPs at the gate would arrest me on the spot for unauthorized civilians. We found a Motel 6 about 15 miles off route, its vacancy sign flickering like a beacon in the storm. I helped them check in. It was a cheap place, smelling of stale smoke and bleach, but it was dry. Once they were safe in the room, I turned to leave. The father, still shivering violently under a thin motel towel, reached out and grabbed my wrist. His eyes dropped to the name tag on my soaked uniform. Evans. He stared at it like he was memorizing scripture. "You don't know what you just did, Lieutenant," he rasped, his voice breaking. "You saved my whole world." I forced a smile, but it felt crooked on my frozen face. "Just keep that baby warm. That's your only mission now." The walk back to the truck felt like the longest mile I'd ever walked. The cabin was empty now, silent except for the drumming rain. It smelled of wet canvas, mud, and the metallic tang of adrenaline fading away. I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking uncontrollably now that the crisis was over. I checked the dashboard clock, 0430. I was 2 hours behind schedule. The military GPS system, the Blue Force tracker, didn't lie. It had logged every second of my unauthorized stop, every mile of my detour. It was all there, in digital red ink. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at the gates of Fort Belvoir. It wouldn't be a commendation. It wouldn't be a medal. It would be Colonel Briggs. I could almost see him sitting in his office, sipping his Starbucks, just waiting to tear me apart. I felt a sudden, crushing weight of loneliness in that cab. I needed to believe that somewhere outside of this army base, people still understood that human life comes before a rule book. I started the engine, swallowing the bitter taste of bile in my throat. I had just played the Good Samaritan, just like the Bible said. But in the eyes of the U.S. Army, I had just become a deserter. I put the truck in gear and headed toward my execution. At 0600, the fist pounding on the door of my transient quarters wasn't a wake-up call. It was a summons. I hadn't even had time to peel off my soaked uniform or scrub the Virginia clay from my skin. 2 military police officers stood in the hallway, their faces stone cold. "Colonel Briggs wants to see you, Lieutenant. Now." They marched me across the base like a criminal. I was still wearing the evidence of my crime. My tactical pants were heavy with dried mud. My boots squelched with every step, and my hair was plastered to my skull. We walked into the administration building, a glass and steel fortress that hummed with efficiency. The transition was brutal. Outside, the world was wet and chaotic. Inside Colonel Briggs's office, it was a climate-controlled sanctuary. The air conditioning was set to a crisp 68 degrees, humming softly. The room smelled expensive, not like the motor pool's burnt coffee, but like a fresh brew from a high-end machine. A Starbucks cup sat steaming on the corner of his mahogany desk, the mermaid logo mocking my exhaustion. Colonel Briggs didn't look up when I entered. He was reviewing a file, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He didn't tell me to stand at ease. He left me standing at the position of attention, rigid, just inside the door. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence was a weapon. I started to shiver, the freezing AC cutting through my damp layers. A drop of muddy water fell from the hem of my jacket and landed on his pristine beige carpet with a soft plip. Then another plip. I was staining his sanctuary, and I knew he was letting it happen on purpose. A silent humiliation before the storm. Finally, 15 minutes in, Briggs took off his glasses. He looked at the puddle forming around my boots, then up at my face. His eyes were devoid of humanity. He looked at me the way one looks at a cockroach that has scurried into a clean kitchen. "Lieutenant Evans," he said, his voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you labor under the delusion that the United States Army provides you with a $500,000 light-medium tactical vehicle so you can operate it as your personal Uber?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Sir, there was a civilian vehicle overturned. A flash flood. There was an infant, blue in the face. They were dying." Bam! Briggs slammed his open palm on the desk. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. I flinched instinctively. "I don't care if it was the President of the United States." Briggs roared, standing up. "Procedure is procedure. You deviated 15 miles off your logged route. You put sensitive military cargo at risk because of some bleeding heart impulse." He walked around the desk, circling me like a shark. He stopped right next to my ear. I could smell his cologne, clean, expensive, overpowering the smell of swamp mud on me. "You know, Evans," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "I have always said that females have no place in tactical transport. You are a liability. You see a few tears and you forget your discipline. It's biology. You can't help your weak emotional nature." The insult hit me harder than the cold. He wasn't just attacking my decision. He was attacking my existence in this uniform. He was reducing 12 years of a perfect service record down to my gender. "You want to play Mother Teresa?" he sneered, stepping back to look me up and down with disgust. "Fine, but don't do it while wearing that flag on your shoulder. You are defiling it with your incompetence." I clenched my hands behind my back, my fingernails digging into my palms until I felt the skin break. I locked my knees. "Do not cry," I told myself. "Do not let him see you break." I would not give him that satisfaction. Briggs walked back to his desk and pulled a single sheet of paper from a folder. The header read, "Gomer, General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand. In the military, this is a career death sentence. It stays in your permanent file forever. It screams failure to every promotion board. Sign this," he said, his voice bored now, the rage replaced by bureaucratic coldness. "As of this morning, you are stripped of your convoy command. Your driving privileges are revoked." He picked up a pen, a sleek silver thing, and tossed it at me. He didn't hand it to me, he tossed it. It hit my chest and clattered to the floor, landing right in the middle of the dirty puddle of water dripping from my clothes. "From tomorrow, you will report to basement level, warehouse B," Briggs said, picking up his coffee and taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Your new duty is inventory. We have a backlog of toilet paper and socks that need counting. Stay out of my sight until I decide if I'm going to kick you out of my army entirely." I looked down at the pen lying in the mud. I had saved 3 lives last night. A father, a mother, and a baby. They were alive right now because of me. And this was my reward. Slowly, painfully, I bent down. My stiff joints cracked. I picked up the wet pen, the mud smearing onto my fingers. I placed the paper on the corner of his desk, trying not to drip on the wood, and signed my name. My hand shook so badly the signature looked like a jagged scar. Millie Evans. I wasn't just signing a reprimand. I was signing away my dignity. I placed the pen back on the desk. Briggs didn't even look up. He had already moved on to the next file, erasing me from his world as if I were nothing more than a stain on his carpet. Warehouse B was located 3 stories underground, a concrete bunker where the sun never rose and the air always smelled of stale cardboard and damp cement. It was a tomb for careers, and now it was my office. For 12 years, my hands had commanded the steering wheels of massive tactical vehicles, feeling the raw power of diesel engines vibrating through my bones. Now, my weapon of choice was a plastic barcode scanner that cost $20 at Office Depot. Beep. 200 pairs of wool socks, size large, I muttered to the empty aisle. My voice sounded hollow, bouncing off the metal shelves that stretched up to the flickering fluorescent lights. Beep. 500 rolls of single-ply toilet paper. Every beep was a reminder of how far I had fallen. Colonel Briggs knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't just want to punish me. He wanted to break me. He wanted to bore me into submission until I voluntarily signed my own discharge papers just to escape the silence. I felt less like a soldier and more like a malfunctioning robot that had been tossed into the scrap heap. By 1200 hours, the silence was deafening. I needed to see human faces, even if they were hostile. I clocked out and headed up to the mess hall. The cafeteria was loud, a chaotic symphony of clattering trays and soldiers shouting over one another. But the moment I stepped into the serving line, the volume dropped. It wasn't total silence, but it was the kind of sudden hush that hits you in the gut. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the room like a contagion. I kept my eyes on my tray, loading it with a dry hamburger patty and a scoop of corn. I walked toward the back corner, looking for an empty table in the shadows. I almost made it. Heads up! A shoulder slammed into mine hard enough to make me stumble. My tray tilted, sending the plastic cup of water splashing over my hand. I regained my balance and looked up into the grinning face of Lieutenant Miller. Miller had always been a yes-man, the kind of officer who polished his boots more often than he trained his platoon. He loomed over me, playing to the audience. "Whoa there, Evans," he boomed, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Watch where you're walking. I heard you're trying to win a Nobel Peace Prize with Army equipment now. Next time you want to play superhero on the taxpayer's dime, maybe ask permission first." A cruel ripple of laughter broke out from the table behind him. "We don't want to have to clean up your mess again," Miller sneered, leaning in close. "Stick to the toilet paper inventory. It suits you." I didn't say a word. I couldn't. If I spoke, I would scream. I just lowered my head, walked to the corner table, and sat down. The hamburger tasted like sawdust. I swallowed it down with the bitter, salty taste of tears that I refused to let fall in public. I couldn't stay there. I dumped my tray and slipped out the back exit, finding refuge near the old payphone bank behind the kitchen. It was a relic, rarely used now that everyone had smartphones, but it offered a shred of privacy. I dialed the number I knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice picked up in rural Virginia. "Hello, Millie. Is that you, baby?" My mom's voice was warm, thick with the accent of the Bible Belt foothills. Just hearing it made my chest ache. "Hi, Mama," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Oh, praise God. I've been worried sick. You haven't called in days with all those storms on the news. Are you safe?" I bit my lips so hard I tasted iron. I looked at my boots, scuffed and dull, standing on the dirty concrete. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that I was drowning, that my career was over, that I was being treated like a pariah. "I'm fine, Mama," I lied. The words felt like ash in my mouth. "Actually, I got a new assignment. It's an administrative role, desk work. It's much safer than the convoys." I heard her let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. "Oh, thank you, Jesus. I always prayed you'd get off those dangerous roads. I'm so proud of you, Millie. You're doing such important work." "Yeah, Mama. Important work." We said our goodbyes. As soon as the line clicked dead, I slid down the wall and curled into a ball on the floor. The lie hurt worse than Miller's shoving. I was protecting her peace by sacrificing my own truth. A moment later, a rough, calloused hand appeared in my vision, holding a steaming styrofoam cup. I jumped, wiping my eyes frantically as I looked up. It was Sergeant First Class Morales. He was an institution at Fort Belvoir, a 30-year veteran with skin like leather and eyes that had seen things most people only saw in movies. He didn't mock me. He didn't ask why I was crying. He just offered the cup. Drink, he grunted. Black. Strong. It'll put the steel back in your spine. I took it, the heat seeping into my cold fingers. Morales leaned against the wall next to me, looking out at the rain. Don't listen to those idiots in there, Lieutenant, he said quietly. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged white scar running from his elbow to his wrist. See this? Fallujah 2004. I got demoted for carrying a wounded Marine onto a chopper instead of securing a crate of ammo. Command said I prioritized sentiments over assets. He looked down at me, his dark eyes intense and unyielding. Ammo crates can be replaced, ma'am. Human souls cannot. He took a sip of his own coffee, his gaze drifting toward the administration building where Briggs sat in his ivory tower. The colonel can strip your rank, Morales said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. He can put you in a basement. But he cannot touch your honor. You did the right thing that night on Route 17. God is your witness, and that is the only promotion board that matters. For the first time in 3 days, the crushing weight on my chest lifted just an inch. I wasn't alone. In this dark, damp basement of a world, a lighthouse had just flickered on. The scuttlebutt moved through the barracks faster than a wildfire in a drought. By 0400 hours, long before the sun even thought about rising over Fort Belvoir, the entire base was awake and in a state of controlled panic. General Warren was coming. He wasn't just some Pentagon bureaucrat pushing papers. General Warren was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. A legendary 4-star general with a reputation for eating incompetent commanders for breakfast. His visits weren't social calls. They were audits of the soul. Immediately, Fort Belvoir transformed into what we cynically called a dog and pony show. It's a theater production designed to hide rot behind a facade of perfection. From the loading dock of Warehouse B, I watched the absurdity unfold. Private first-class soldiers were on their hands and knees scrubbing the concrete sidewalks with toothbrushes. I saw a squad painting brown patches of dying grass with green spray paint just so the lawn would look vibrant from the general's passing motorcade. It was fake. It was desperate. And down in my basement exile, counting socks, I hoped that the storm would stay up there on the surface and leave me alone. I was wrong. At 1000 hours, the phone on the concrete wall rang. It was the administration building. Colonel Briggs wanted to see me again. This time, when I walked into his office, the atmosphere had shifted. The air wasn't charged with the explosive rage from yesterday. It was heavy with cold calculation. Briggs was standing by the window, watching the manic preparations outside. He turned around, and for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a shark that smells blood in the water. Lieutenant Evans, he said, his voice smooth, almost sweet. Please take a seat. I remained standing. I prefer to stand, sir. Suit yourself. He walked over and leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk, crossing his arms casually. Tomorrow morning, General Warren will be holding a command briefing in the war room. He wants a full report on incident rates and logistical anomalies. He paused, studying my face like he was reading a map. I have an opportunity for you, Millie. A chance at redemption. My stomach churned. He never used my first name. I want you to present the incident from the other night, he continued. But we need to frame it correctly. You will stand up there and you will tell the general that you had a lapse in judgment. You acted on emotion, panicked, and deviated from the route due to inexperience. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were partners. And then you will say that thanks to my swift intervention and strict disciplinary guidance, the situation was contained and protocol was restored. You are the example of a mistake. I am the example of the correction. Do you? I stared at him, horrified. He wanted me to purge myself. He wanted me to paint myself as an incompetent fool just so he could look like a strong leader in front of a 4-star general. He wanted to use my act of mercy as a stepping stone for his own promotion. "Sir," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. "I saved a family. I won't stand there and lie. I won't say it was a mistake." Briggs's smile vanished instantly. The shark eyes returned, dead and flat. "Listen to me very carefully, Millie," he hissed, stepping into my personal space until I could smell the coffee on his breath. "You have 18 years of service. You are exactly 2 years away from your 22-year mark. You are 2 years away from a full pension for life, 2 years away from guaranteed healthcare and a secure retirement." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. He knew exactly where to hit. I came from nothing in the Virginia coal country. That pension was my only safety net. Without it, I was just a middle-aged woman with a bad back and no civilian skills, facing an old age of poverty. "If you embarrass me in front of General Warren," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet, "I will ensure your discharge papers cite gross misconduct. You will be kicked out with an other than honorable discharge. You will lose your pension. You will lose your benefits. You will leave this army with nothing but the shirt on your back." He leaned back, checking his manicured fingernails. "So, you have a choice. Be my puppet for 10 minutes or be homeless by Christmas." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was blackmail, pure and simple. But it was blackmail I couldn't fight. The system was rigged, and he held the keys. "Go home," Briggs ordered, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Iron your Class A uniform. Make sure those creases are sharp. I want you to look like a repentant, disciplined soldier tomorrow." That is an order. That night, my small transient room was filled with the hissing sound of a steam iron. Hiss, press, hiss, press. I laid my dress uniform jacket on the board. The dark fabric looked almost black in the dim light. I pressed the iron down, flattening the wrinkles just like Briggs was flattening my soul. The steam rose up, clouding the cheap mirror on the wall. I looked up at my reflection, but the face looking back was blurry, distorted by the fog. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I wasn't the brave lieutenant who jumped into a freezing flood to save a child. I was a coward. I was a woman terrified of losing her paycheck, terrified of the future, willing to sell her honor to a tyrant just to survive. I hung the uniform on the door. It looked perfect, stiff, hollow, just like me. Tomorrow, I would walk onto that stage and play my part. I was no longer a soldier. I was just a prop in Briggs's show. That night, the rain returned to Fort Belvoir. It wasn't the violent storm of the other night, but a steady, rhythmic drumming against the tin roof of the transient barracks. Asterisk tap. Tap. Tap star. It sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock, counting down the seconds until my execution. I lay on the narrow bunk, staring up at the springs of the empty bed above me. The room was dark, but sleep was impossible. My mind was a battlefield. Tomorrow morning, I would stand in front of the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, a man whose shadow alone commanded respect, and I would have to look him in the eye and call myself a failure. I would have to lie. I would have to burn down 12 years of hard work just to keep Colonel Briggs warm in a seat of power. Was it worth it for a pension? For health insurance? I reached under my pillow, my fingers brushing against cracked leather. It was a small Bible, the pages worn thin and yellowed with age. It was the only thing my father had left me when he died. He was a coal miner from the Appalachians, a man with dust in his lungs and steel in his spine. The black lung took him piece by piece, but it never took his dignity. I turned on the small reading light, shielding it with my hand so I wouldn't wake the others. I opened the book. It naturally fell open to the Gospel of Luke. I didn't need to read the words. I knew them by heart. It was the story of the man beaten and left half dead on the side of the road, ignored by the priest and the Levite, but saved by the Samaritan. I could almost hear my father's raspy voice, the way it sounded between coughing fits. "Millie, baby," he used to say, sitting on the porch swing. "You can be poor. You can be a nobody in the eyes of the bank or the government, but you can never be poor in honor. When you wake up in the morning and look in that mirror, you have to like the person looking back at you. If you don't, no amount of money will fix it." My finger traced the final command in red letters, "Go and do likewise." I had done likewise, Daddy. I had stopped. I had helped. But why did the price have to be everything I had? Why was God punishing me for obeying Him? The tears finally came, hot and silent, soaking into the pillowcase. I felt totally abandoned. There was no angel in the room, just the smell of damp wool and the crushing weight of tomorrow. By 0500, the rain had stopped. I got up before the sun. I sat on the edge of my bed with my dress boots and a tin of kiwi polish. The ritual of the spit shine is meditation for a soldier. Small circles, swish, 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 water, wax, friction. I focused entirely on the toe of the boot until the black leather disappeared and became a black mirror. Looking sharp, Evans. I froze. Lieutenant Miller was leaning against the doorframe, holding a travel mug of coffee. He was already in his dress blues, looking smug. "You really are going all out for your big apology tour, huh?" He walked over, looking down at me with that pitying smirk that makes you want to scream. "Don't worry about the truck. Once Briggs kicks you to the curb, I promised him I'd take good care of your vehicle. Lieutenant Miller has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" He patted my shoulder, a condescending, heavy pat. "Come on, don't look so grim. Maybe soldiering just isn't in your DNA. You're a nice lady. Go back to Virginia. Find a husband. Settle down. Leave the heavy lifting to the men." Rage, white-hot and blinding, flared in my chest. I wanted to throw the boot at him. I wanted to scream that I could outdrive and outlift him any day of the week. But I didn't. I just looked at my reflection in the toe of the boot. "Go and do likewise." "Excuse me, Lieutenant," I said, my voice dead calm. "I have to finish getting ready." He laughed, shaking his head as he walked away. "Suit yourself. Break a leg out there." At 0800 hours, the PA system crackled to life. "Attention on deck. General Warren's motorcade has passed the main gate." This was it. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I adjusted my tie, tightening the knot until it felt like a noose. I smoothed the jacket of my Class A uniform. The woman in the mirror looked tired. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her cheeks hollow. But the uniform was perfect. Sharp creases. Shiny brass. I took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of boot polish and the damp earth outside. I didn't know what was going to happen in that war room. I could lose my pension. I could lose my career. I could end up scanning groceries at Walmart for the rest of my life. But as I pushed open the heavy metal door of the barracks, something shifted. The storm had broken. The morning sun was cutting through the clouds, hitting the wet pavement and making it shine like diamonds. The light hit my face, warm and blinding. I blinked, and in that split second, the fear evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't Briggs's puppet. I wasn't a female liability. I was the daughter of a coal miner who died with his soul intact. I was Lieutenant Millie Evans. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and stepped out into the light. I was ready to face the fire. The war room was colder than a meat locker. I don't know if they kept the thermostat at 60 degrees to keep the servers from overheating or to keep the officers awake, but the chill cut right through my dress uniform. It was a sterile, windowless chamber dominated by a massive polished mahogany table. At the far end, flanking a large projection screen, stood the American flag and the Army flag, their gold tassels still and heavy. At the head of the table sat General Warren. I had seen him on CNN and in official portraits, but seeing him in person was different. He didn't look like a movie general. He wasn't barking orders or chomping on a cigar. He was small, almost unassuming, with gray hair cropped close to his scalp. But the 4 silver stars on each of his shoulders caught the fluorescent light with a terrifying brilliance. He radiated a quiet, absolute authority that made the air in the room feel thin. Around the table sat his staff, bird colonels and majors with clipboards, sitting frozen like statues. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the projector fan and the turning of pages as General Warren silently reviewed the briefing packet. I stood in the back corner, the designated spot for the accused, feeling smaller than a speck of dust. "Proceed," General Warren said. He didn't look up. Colonel Briggs practically leapt into action. He strode to the front of the room, clicking a laser pointer with the confidence of a man who believes his own hype. "General, as you can see from this quarterly analysis," Briggs began, his voice booming in the acoustic dead space. "The Fort Belvoir Transport Division is operating at 110% efficiency. Our maintenance cycles are ahead of schedule, and our disciplinary rates are at historic lows." He clicked through slides of colorful pie charts and graphs. I knew for a fact that half those numbers were massaged, but up there on the big screen, they looked like gospel. "However," Briggs said, his tone shifting to one of grave seriousness, "we do not tolerate deviation. Strict adherence to protocol is the backbone of this unit." He turned and pointed the red laser dot at the floor near my feet. "This brings me to the incident on the night of October 14th. I have brought Lieutenant Evans here today as a case study." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Briggs beckoned me forward with a sharp jerk of his head. I walked to the end of the table, my legs feeling like they were made of wood. I snapped to the position of attention, staring straight ahead at the wall, avoiding General Warren's gaze. "Lieutenant Gene Evans," Briggs said. "My middle name is Marie." He didn't even know my name. He didn't care. To him, I was just a prop. On the night in question, Briggs continued, addressing the general. "Lieutenant Evans made a critical error in judgment. While transporting sensitive cargo, she allowed female emotion to override her training. She panicked during a storm, abandoned her designated route, and put the mission at risk." He paused for effect, letting the words female emotion hang in the air like a bad smell. "It was a stupid mistake," Briggs said, using the word stupid right in front of the Vice Chief of Staff, a lapse caused by inexperience and a lack of fortitude. However, thanks to my immediate intervention and the issuance of a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, the situation was contained. Lieutenant Evans has accepted full responsibility and understands that her career is now under review." Briggs turned to me, his eyes bored into mine. I could see the threat written clearly in his gaze. Say it. Admit you were stupid. Save your pension, Lieutenant. Briggs barked. Confirm for the general that your actions were a result of poor judgment and that you accept the disciplinary measures. I opened my mouth. The script was ready. Yes, sir. It was my fault, sir. I was scared, sir. I thought about the 2 years left until retirement. I thought about the health insurance I needed for my back. I thought about being homeless at 40. The fear was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, suffocating me in that moment, standing between a lie that would save me and a truth that could destroy me. I felt paralyzed. The room started to spin. I felt totally alone against a giant. I took a breath, but the words wouldn't come out. My throat had closed up. Wait. The single word cut through the tension like a knife. It wasn't loud, but it stopped the world. General Warren hadn't moved. He was still looking down at the file, but now, slowly, he closed the folder. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the mahogany table with a deliberate click. Then he looked up. He didn't look at Colonel Briggs. He looked past him, straight at me. His eyes were still gray, sharp, and piercing, but they didn't hold the anger I expected. They were searching. It was a look of intense, almost unnerving recognition. "Lieutenant Evans," the general said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the hair on my arms stand up. Ignore the colonel's flowery language for a moment. He pushed the Gomer paperwork, the career death sentence I had signed, to the side as if it were trash. "I want to hear it from you," Warren said directly. "What exactly did you do at 0200 hours on October 14th on Route 17? Briggs turned pale. He stepped forward, trying to block the general's view of me. "General." "She is confused. She has already admitted." General Warren didn't even turn his head. He simply raised one hand, palm out, silencing Briggs instantly. "I am asking your soldier, Colonel," Warren said, his voice dropping an octave, deadly and cold. "Not you." He locked eyes with me again, waiting. The silence in the room was deafening. The charade was cracking, and I was the only one holding the hammer. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in my own ears. My heart was hammering against my ribs so violently I thought everyone in the silent war room could hear it. Briggs was staring at me, his eyes wide and threatening, silently screaming at me to stick to the script. Say it. Say you were stupid. Save your pension, but I couldn't do it. Standing there under the glare of the Vice Chief of Staff, I realized that if I was going to lose my career today, I wasn't going to lose my soul with it. "General," I said. My voice shook, but the words were clear. "I did stop my vehicle unauthorized." Briggs nodded slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He thought I was folding. But it wasn't a mistake due to inexperience, I continued, lifting my chin. I saw a civilian SUV overturned in a flash flood. The water was rising. There was a baby inside, blue from hypothermia. I used my LMTV to tow them to safety because if I hadn't, they would be dead right now. I locked eyes with General Warren, bracing myself for the explosion. Beside me, I heard Briggs inhale sharply, ready to interrupt, ready to bury me. But the explosion didn't come. General Warren didn't scream. He didn't order the MPs to drag me out. Instead, he slowly stood up. He walked around the massive mahogany table, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He stopped right in front of me. "Lieutenant Evans," he said, his voice unreadable. "I have 3 questions for you." "Yes, sir." "First," he said, holding up one finger. "Was the sensitive military cargo you were hauling damaged or compromised in any way during this rescue?" "No, sir," I answered instantly. The seals remained intact. The load was secure. "Second, did you complete your mission and deliver the payload to the depot?" "Yes, sir." I arrived 45 minutes behind schedule, but the delivery was completed. "Third," Warren said, leaning in slightly. "Was any soldier or civilian injured during the operation of your vehicle?" "No, sir." Everyone walked away safe. General Warren nodded slowly. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Then he spun on his heel, turning his back on me to face Colonel Briggs. The calm demeanor vanished. His eyes were suddenly blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. "So, Colonel Briggs," Warren said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You stand here and tell me that saving 3 American lives without compromising a single piece of Army property is what you call, what was the word you used? Stupid?" Briggs turned the color of ash. He stammered, his confident facade crumbling instantly. "General." "Sir, rules are rules. We have strict protocols." She was reckless. She acted on emotion. Bam! General Warren slammed his open hand onto the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot, making every officer in the room jump. "Reckless." Warren roared. You call that reckless? He reached into the breast pocket of his dress uniform and pulled out a photograph. He slapped it down onto the polished wood, sliding it across the table until it stopped right in front of Briggs. It was a grainy black and white printout from a security camera. I recognized the angle immediately. It was the parking lot of the Motel 6. It showed my massive LMTV parked sideways, shielding a small, battered SUV from the driving rain. I received a phone call at 0300 that night, General Warren said, his voice trembling with an emotion that wasn't anger anymore. From a man who thought he was going to die in a ditch. He told me that a soldier stopped when no one else would. Warren pointed a shaking finger at the photo. That man in the car, Colonel, is my son-in-law. The woman holding the baby is my daughter, Sarah. A collective gasp went through the room. The air seemed to be sucked out of the space. General Warren took a step closer to Briggs, his voice cracking. And that blue-lipped infant, the one you said Lieutenant Evans was stupid to save? That is my only grandson. The silence that followed was absolute. Colonel Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. His hands were shaking so badly that the silver pen he was holding, the same laser pointer he had used to mock me, slipped from his sweaty fingers. It clattered loudly onto the floor, rolling away under the table. He looked at me, then at the general, terror flooding his eyes as the realization hit him. He hadn't just disciplined a soldier. He had tried to destroy the woman who saved his boss's family. General Warren turned away from Briggs as if he didn't exist. He walked back to me. The steel in his eyes melted away. He wasn't the vice chief of staff anymore. He was a grandfather. My son-in-law told me they saw your name tag, Warren said softly. He said you told him his only mission was to keep that baby warm. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a formal gesture. It was a squeeze of pure, desperate gratitude. You didn't break the rules, Lieutenant. He whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. You rewrote the rule on humanity that your commander seems to have forgotten. You saved my whole world. I felt the tears finally spill over. I tried to stay at attention, but my shoulders shook. The knot of fear and humiliation that had been strangling me for 3 days suddenly unraveled. I wasn't a failure. I wasn't a disgrace. I was a soldier. And I had done the right thing. The silence in the war room was no longer heavy. It was electric. All eyes were glued to Colonel Briggs, who was sweating so profusely that beads of perspiration were dripping onto his stiff collar. The confident, arrogant commander who had strutted around the room 5 minutes ago with his laser pointer was gone. In his place was a desperate man trying to salvage a career that was rapidly disintegrating. General, sir, Briggs stammered, his voice rising in panic. He looked around the room for support, but found none. Please, you have to understand. I had no idea. I didn't know it was your daughter. If I had known it was your family involved, obviously, I would have authorized the stop. I would have sent an escort. Stop. General Warren cut him off. The word was soft, but it hit with the force of a physical blow. The general looked at Briggs with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. That is precisely the problem, Colonel, Warren said, shaking his head slowly. If you had known it was my family, you would have pinned a medal on her chest yourself. You would have rolled out the red carpet. But because you thought they were just anonymous civilians, just nobodies dying in a ditch? You tried to destroy her. Warren took a step closer, towering over the shrinking colonel. A soldier's integrity is not measured by who they save, Colonel. It is measured by who they are. Lieutenant Evans didn't stop because she wanted a reward or because she checked the rank of the victims. She stopped because she is a soldier, and that is what soldiers do. We protect. Briggs opened his mouth to speak, desperate to spin the narrative, but Warren silenced him with a glare that could peel paint. I saw your base this morning, Briggs, Warren continued, gesturing vaguely towards the window. I saw the painted grass. I saw the privates scrubbing the sidewalks with toothbrushes. You spend so much time polishing the surface, making things look pretty for the brass, that you've let the core rot. He pointed a finger directly at Briggs's chest. You measure leadership by spreadsheets and perfectly creased uniforms. But leadership isn't about control. It's about trust. You have built a unit based on fear. You have turned brave men and women into emotionless machines who are terrified to do the right thing because they might get a reprimand. You almost crushed the only officer in this room who still has a moral compass. Briggs hung his head, his shoulders slumped. He knew it was over. The room was witnessing a live execution of a career. General Warren walked back to the table and picked up the Gomer. The official reprimand that Briggs had forced me to sign, the paper that was supposed to end my career. He held it up for a moment, letting every officer in the room see the lie written in black and white. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it in half. Rip, the sound was incredibly loud in the quiet room. He put the halves together and tore them again. Rip, he walked over to the trash can in the corner and let the confetti pieces flutter down into the bin. Colonel Briggs, Warren said, his voice cold and official. You are relieved of your command, effective immediately. You have 1 hour to clear out your desk. Briggs looked up, his face pale, his eyes hollow. General, where? Where will I go? Warren smiled. But there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of poetic justice. I have the perfect spot for a man who loves paperwork and procedures so much, Warren said. I am transferring you to the Records Archive Division at the Pentagon, basement level 4. It has no windows, Colonel, just miles of files and dust. I almost gasped. It was the exact same punishment Briggs had tried to inflict on me. He wanted to bury me in a basement counting socks. Now he would spend the rest of his career in a basement counting dusty files, buried under the weight of his own bureaucracy. You can count paper clips to your heart's content down there, Warren finished. At least in the basement, you can't hurt anyone else. Now get out of my sight. Briggs didn't salute. He couldn't. He just turned and walked out of the war room. He moved like an old man, his footsteps dragging on the polished floor. As he passed the table of staff officers, no one looked at him. No one offered a sympathetic glance. He was a ghost walking out of his own life. When the heavy door clicked shut behind him, the tension in the room finally broke. I looked around. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The other officers, majors, and lieutenant colonels, who had looked at me with disdain or indifference just 10 minutes ago, were now looking at me differently. The contempt was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect? Caution? Yes, but respect. My eyes found Lieutenant Miller across the room. The man who had mocked me, who had told me to go home and find a husband, was staring at his boots. His face was flushed red. He couldn't even meet my gaze. I stood a little taller. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't shouted or fought back with insults. I had simply stood on the truth. And the truth had set me free. Justice had been served, not by a sword, but by a grandfather's gratitude. After the officers filed out of the war room, leaving the heavy echoes of Colonel Briggs's downfall behind them, General Warren signaled for me to stay. The room was quiet now. The air scrubbed clean of the suffocating tension that had choked it for the last hour. The general didn't sit back down at the head of the massive mahogany table. Instead, he walked over to where I was standing and pulled a smartphone from his pocket. His hands, which had just torn a colonel's career to shreds with terrifying efficiency, were gentle now as he tapped the screen. He told me he wanted to show me something, turning the device toward me. It was a video, shaky and vertical, clearly taken in a warm, messy living room. A little girl with curly blonde hair was bouncing on a beige sofa, clutching a worn-out, stuffed bear. She looked healthy, her cheeks pink and full of life. A stark contrast to the blue-lipped, freezing infant I had seen trapped in that storm. A woman's voice from behind the camera encouraged her to say hi, and the little girl beamed at the lens, waving frantically as she chirped a thank you to the firefighter lady for the ride. I let out a wet, shaky laugh at the title, and General Warren chuckled softly beside me, wiping a stray tear from the corner of his eye. He explained that to a 3-year-old, my massive LMTV looked just like a fire truck. She didn't know ranks or uniforms. She just knew I came when no one else did. He put the phone away and looked at me, his face serious and filled with an emotion that transcended military protocol. He told me that the little girl would grow up and have a life because of me. He said he owed me a debt he could never repay, addressing me as Major. When I confusedly corrected him that I was a lieutenant, he simply smiled and told me that I wouldn't be for long. That private acknowledgement was a reward in itself, but the Army had a much more public way of setting things right. 1 week later, the sun was blazing over the parade field at Fort Belvoir. The sky, a piercing blue that had been washed clean by the storms of the previous week. The entire transport battalion was assembled in formation. A sea of camouflage standing at attention under the heat. This wasn't a punishment detail or a routine drill. This was a celebration. The PA system crackled to life, echoing across the manicured grass, calling for attention to orders. I marched out to the center of the field, my freshly shined boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. I stood before General Warren, who was flanked by the American flag and the battalion colors snapping in the breeze. Usually, an officer climbs the career ladder one painful rung at a time, moving from lieutenant to captain and then eventually to major. But today, the Army was making a rare exception for exceptional valor and leadership. General Warren stepped forward and removed the single silver bar from my chest, the rank of first lieutenant. In its place, he pinned on a gold oak leaf. I had skipped an entire rank, going from a junior officer to a field-grade commander in a single heartbeat. His voice boomed over the loudspeakers as he appointed Major Millie Evans as the new battalion commander of the Tactical Transport Division. Leaning in close as he adjusted the collar of my uniform, he told me quietly that he didn't want another Briggs running this unit. He wanted someone who knew that people mattered more than paperwork, and he wanted my conscience to lead the battalion. However, the promotion wasn't the most significant news of the day. Before dismissing the troops, General Warren announced a new standing order, effective immediately across all Army commands. It was officially titled Regulation 19C, but everyone on base was already calling it by its real name, the Samaritan Rule. The rule was simple but revolutionary, stating that any military personnel operating a government vehicle were authorized to deviate from their route and utilize government assets to provide emergency assistance to civilians in life-threatening distress, without fear of administrative reprisal. My name wasn't on the document, but as the general read the words, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. The terror I had felt that night, the impossible choice between my career and a baby's life, was something no other soldier would ever have to face again. Kindness had finally been codified into law. As the ceremony ended and the formation broke, soldiers came up to shake my hand with genuine respect. I was walking back toward the headquarters when a shadow fell across my path. I stopped to find Lieutenant Miller standing there. He looked different than before. The smug, arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a look of awkward humility. He was holding his cover in his hands, twisting the fabric nervously as he struggled to speak. He quietly congratulated me, and then stumbled through an apology for his past comments about me not belonging and needing to find a husband. He looked down at his boots, admitting he had been a jerk. I looked at him, remembering the rage I felt when he mocked me in the barracks. I could have used my new rank to humiliate him or assigned him to the basement inventory duty. But then I thought of Sergeant Morales and his lesson that human souls cannot be replaced. If I crushed Miller now, I was no better than Briggs. I extended my hand firmly. I told him it was forgotten. And as he took my hand in a firm grip, I gave him a small smile. I ordered him back to work with one piece of advice: never laugh at someone trying to do the right thing, because you never know when you might need a Samaritan yourself. Miller nodded, and for the first time, the salute he gave me was genuine. I watched him walk away, then turn toward the motor pool with a full heart. I had a battalion to run, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 1 year had passed since the storm that changed everything, and the seasons in Virginia had turned a full circle. The dogwood trees outside the administration building were shedding their leaves, painting the sidewalks in shades of russet and gold. I sat behind the large mahogany desk, the same desk where Colonel Briggs used to sit and clean his fingernails while ignoring his soldiers. But the room felt different now. Under Briggs, this office had been a fortress, sealed tight with blinds drawn, and the air conditioning set to a meat locker chill. Now the windows were cracked open, letting in the crisp autumn breeze and the distant sounds of the motor pool. The expensive espresso machine was gone, replaced by a standard-issue drip coffee maker that gurgled happily in the corner. The pot was always full of hot, cheap coffee, and the door was always open. Soldiers didn't stand at rigid attention when they came in here anymore. They came to talk, to plan, and sometimes just to breathe. My unit, the Tactical Transport Division, had earned a new nickname around Fort Belvoir. They called us the Samaritan Squad. It wasn't an official Army doctrine, but it was written on our hearts. In the last 12 months, my drivers had stopped to assist in over 50 roadside emergencies along the winding back roads of the Blue Ridge foothills. We had pulled cars out of ditches, changed tires for stranded grandmothers, and provided first aid at accident scenes until the paramedics arrived. We proved that you could deliver the Army's cargo on time and still carry hope to the people you swore to protect. I shifted in my chair, picking up a plain white envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. There was no military rank on the return address, just a name and a P.O. box in rural Ohio. It was from the man who had tried to destroy me. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was familiar, but it looked different, shakier, less aggressive than the sharp signature I remembered on my reprimand. Former Colonel Briggs wasn't sitting in a Pentagon basement anymore. He had retired quietly 6 months ago. Now, he wrote, he was volunteering at a Red Cross distribution center. He described his days not as a commander barking orders, but as a worker moving crates of supplies for disaster relief. He talked about the backaches and the sweat, the physical toll of manual labor that he used to despise. But then came the lines that made me pause. He wrote that for the first time in 20 years, he was sleeping through the night. He admitted that the warehouse work was humbling, but it was honest. He thanked me for teaching him the hardest lesson of his life, that honor isn't something you wear on your shoulder loops. It's something you carry in your chest. He ended the letter asking for forgiveness for the arrogant old fool he used to be. I folded the paper slowly and placed it in my drawer. There was no bitterness left in me, only a quiet sense of peace. Forgiveness, I had learned, was never really for the other person. It was a gift you gave yourself to let go of the heavy baggage of hate. I hoped he found his redemption among those crates. I looked up at the only decoration on my desk. It wasn't a medal or a plaque or a certificate of commendation. It was a cheap black plastic frame holding a grainy, low-resolution photograph. General Warren had sent it to me a week after my promotion. It was a still frame printed from the security camera of the Motel 6 that night. The image was blurry, streaked with digital rain, and completely black and white. It showed a massive dark shape, my LMTV truck parked sideways across the frame. Tucked behind it, sheltered from the fury of the storm, was the small, fragile silhouette of the civilian SUV. It wasn't a beautiful picture. To anyone else, it just looked like a traffic jam in a storm. But to me, it was the most beautiful thing I owned. On the back, in his neat cursive script, the general had written, * for the days when the storms return. So you never forget what real courage looks like, *. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb. That photo was my compass. It reminded me that the biggest machine is nothing without a human heart behind the wheel. Outside, the sky began to darken. A gray curtain of clouds rolled over Fort Belvoir, and the first drops of rain began to splatter against the windowpane. It was starting again. Another Virginia storm was brewing, threatening to turn the dirt roads into rivers of mud. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the motor pool. The engines were roaring to life. A convoy of 20 LMTVs was lined up, their headlights cutting through the gloom, ready to transport supplies to the coast. I picked up the radio handset from my desk. The plastic felt cool and familiar in my palm. I keyed the mic. My voice steady and calm. "Attention all Samaritan stations. This is Samaritan 6, I said, watching the rain intensify. We have heavy weather incoming. The roads are going to be slick, and visibility will be near zero. Your mission is to get the payload to the destination." I paused, looking at the grainy photo on my desk one last time. "But remember your standing orders. Keep your eyes open. If you see someone in trouble, you stop. We don't leave anyone behind in the dark. Watch your 6 and drive safe. Samaritan 6 out." I hung up the radio and watched as the convoy began to roll out the gate, big wheels turning through the puddles. The storm was coming, loud and dangerous, just like it had a year ago. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I knew that no matter how dark the night got, we were the ones driving the lights. We were the ones carrying the fire. And that was a legacy worth more than any rank. You know, looking back at that rainy night on Route 17, I realized that we often confuse rank with leadership, and rules with righteousness. But the truest test of character isn't what you do when the sun is shining and the general is watching. It's what you do in the dark, when the only witness is your own conscience. We are all driving our own heavy trucks through life, focused on our deadlines and our paychecks. It's easy to just keep driving. But never let your schedule become more important than a human soul. Real honor isn't something that can be pinned on a uniform or framed on a wall. It is earned in the mud, by lifting others out of their storms. Always choose to be the Samaritan. Now, I want to turn the mic over to you. I know I'm not the only one who has faced a hard choice. Have you ever had to break a rule to do what you knew was right? Or maybe you were the one stuck in the ditch, praying for headlights to appear? Tell me your stories in the comments below. I'm listening.